So the theme for this session, the imperative for conservation to address more, is based on or reflective of many conversations that I've been hearing around the region, as well as that I've been participating in. That people are saying that biodiversity conservation, climate resilience, and land justice are interconnected. They're also talking about how conservation needs to be better integrated with land use planning and vice versa. And so we're going to get into this through this panel discussion. But first, I want to build on the context that Katie started with around this session. That this is the product of lessons and learnings over the past several years' gatherings. And I'm going to mention just three. The first is that we know that land conservation is part of a more complex land system that includes land ownership, planning, development, and regulation. And that whole system has been unjust for hundreds of years. In order for conservation to work, in order for our conservation work to be more just, we need to listen to and build reciprocal relationships with communities and groups who we've marginalized in the past. And third, RCPs want to continue to conserve biodiversity. They want to address climate change and help advance land justice. But increasingly, they're being called on to also support food security, affordable housing, public health, and renewable energy. But they often struggle with knowing how to do more, how to pursue multiple objectives with limited capacity. So our keynote discussion is in two main parts. The first part is each of our speakers will provide brief remarks in order from left to right. And then we'll have a Q&A session. So I'm going to introduce Onika Abraham Lee. So our first keynote speaker, Onika Abraham Lee, is the executive director of the Blue Sky Funders Forum, based in New York City. Blue Sky is a funders collaborative that exists to move the work of connecting people with the out-of-doors from a nice-to-have to an absolute necessity. Before Blue Sky, Onika led the New York City Farm School for adult students in sustainable agriculture and food sovereignty. She founded and taught at A Farmers Yoga and held several communications and marketing positions with nonprofits and business. She earned a BA from Georgetown University and an MBA from Baruch College. It's clear from her LinkedIn profile that in both her professional and volunteer work, she's been an effective servant leader in individual and community empowerment for 2 decades. Another reason that Onika is here is that I was speaking to the executive director of the Elmina B. Sewell Foundation, Gabriela Alcalde, about integrated land use and land justice. This was one of those conversations I mentioned earlier. And I want to know from her perspective, who in the philanthropic community saw equity as central to the future of conservation. And we're also seeking to learn more about integration and coordination around land use and access. And Gabriela had one person in mind, and that was Onika. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Bill. Oh my boy, I have to update that LinkedIn profile clearly. But thank you for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I have many years behind me, and none of them are in conservation. So a lot of what I was excited to do is to just be in community with you and the fellow panelists to talk about what this means in light of my deep interests. And my deep interests are really around land and power and equity and justice. And that's been sort of a through line through a lot of the work that I've done. I'm really excited to be with Blue Sky. I started 4 months ago. It feels like 4 minutes ago. But I've been here long enough to know that there are 42 funders from across the country. So we really our members are more or less private foundations. We also have some corporate foundations and some community foundations, but they all believe in a vision. And that vision is, what does it look like if every single person, regardless of age, race, ethnicity, background, has the right and the opportunity for meaningful interactions and connections to nature and the outdoors. What does that look like? That is the vision that we're striving for together. And I think that those words, the right and the opportunity, are important ones in that vision. The right is a fact, in my mind. I think that that is, as beings on this planet, we do have a right to be within the realm of the outdoors and nature. Nature is exactly what we are. We are part of nature. It's under my nails. It's within my body. It is me. And I think the severance of that connection to nature, of being essential to our being, has been to the detriment of our health and our communities, our cultures, and so many of the ills that we're trying to repair through our work are caused by that essential misunderstanding and disconnection from what we really and truly are. And so many people have said it much better than I have before, but I deeply believe that. So from Blue Skies Funders' perspective, what we come together to do, because they are funders, is motivate funding, motivate and inspire philanthropy to move more dollars into this field, to really understand and underscore the importance of that essential connection to nature and all of the different outcomes and benefits that can come from it. And so in Blue Sky, our funders, the latest data we have around giving was from 2018. We're about to re-up that. But in 2018, our funders gave about $54 million to environmental literacy, education, connections to nature, things of that nature. And that was about 6% of all environmental funding, because as I'm sure I'm sure Sasha will get into, environmental funding generally is quite large, 1.6 billion. I don't even know what it is now today, that was 2018. So this is only 6%, it's a small proportion. And I think as we'll get into soon, it's hard for me to complain about that, truthfully, when I think about like the 0.3% of funding that goes to indigenous communities and in rural communities. There are many places where our money can be leveraged and done better. But I think part of my work at Blue Sky is to make people realize the connections, how nature can be a pathway and a throughway to that work. And I think I wrote down what you said, Katie. I'm sure, isn't it 2 minutes yet? No, it's not, okay. I'll just keep going. I thought I wasn't gonna be able to do 5 minutes, but here we go. But the last thing I'll say before we hopefully get into dialogue and we hear more from my partners here is I loved your saying that connecting to what inspires you can lead the way. And that's definitely been a big part of my own career and just life trajectory. I think I'll get into how much the nature has really inspired me. And I think that is true. And I also think that can lead you astray. Because I think without really understanding what you need to, that connection hopefully will connect you to other people who also love and share and are passionate about what moves you. Because without that connection, you can really do damage. Much damage has been done by people who love nature and the environment. Tons of damage has been done by that, because if you're being myopic about that and you're really only thinking about the ways that benefits you or your own vision, it's easy to not see the collateral damage that happens around that. And so I'll leave it there. I think we'll come back to that point, but that feels really important to me. Thank you.
We're definitely going to get back into that, the collateral damage. I've never heard of that concept around this. It's awesome. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Sasha Spector. As his bio reads, Sasha oversees all of Doris Duke Foundation's grant making on climate change, land conservation and stewardship, and inclusive conservation. Throughout his career, Sasha's been working across scales and sectors, whether getting his PhD in ecology, studying insect-habitat relationships, from local to regional scales, to managing the invertebrate conservation program for the American Museum of Natural History, to guiding the scientific activities across multiple sectors and scales for biodiversity conservation and economic revitalization with scenic Hudson. Sasha cares deeply about landscapes and partnerships across the entire U.S., but has a soft spot for the Appalachian Mountain region. And he is one of the panelists in the morning workshop on that topic. So Sasha, thanks so much for being here and for your remarks.
Thanks. It's great to be with all of you today. It's great to be back in person and to have a gathering of the community again like this. The Doris Duke Foundation, as some of you might know from listening to NPR, is a national private funder. And we work for the well-being of people and planet in order to create a more equitable, creative, and sustainable future for all of us. And we do that through the work of a set of national grant-making programs, of which the environment is one, and operating a few actual physical locations, including Duke Farms in central New Jersey and the Shangri-La Museum on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. The environment program is trying to reconcile this question by thinking of land conservation and stewardship as a multi-solution, an action by which we can address and solve the biodiversity, climate, and equity crises in America. We do that by accelerating the pace and scale of land conservation through collaborative and science-based work, which all of you are pursuing, by propelling the capacity of nature to sequester and be part, basically to provide 20% of the nation's climate mitigation goal, which it can do if we let it, and to address equity and create a more inclusive conservation movement, especially through the recent launch of our Indigenous-led conservation initiative, which we spearheaded with 15 other foundations earlier this year to announce a $102 million commitment for Indigenous-led work around the country, and supporting BIPOC-led organizations to be part of the conservation mainstream. All of which gets back to the same activity, and the one that all of you in this room are deeply involved in, is caring for, protecting, restoring, and better managing the lands on which we live. And that work of enabling non-human people to persist on the landscape, to bring people together in service of the land, and to make sure that everyone who wants to be and who has an aspiration to not just access nature, but to also be the land stewards that they want, to bring their knowledge to the table in service of the land, is the multi-solution. So when I think ahead of to the kind of the fundamental question at in here, what does a just landscape look like? It's when all of those things are working in tandem, all three, in order to create a nature-positive, carbon-negative, justice-forward landscape in which we're addressing justice across all of them, really. We're addressing the injustice that we're doing to our non-human relatives. We're addressing the intergenerational injustice that climate change represents. And we're seeking to address the injustices that have happened before and are happening now in a land system that, as multiple people have said, has been built on distorted and racist power structures. So the way we go at this, I think, and how we solve for all of these things on a single landscape, there's only one landscape in which to achieve all these objectives, is really the heart of this question. And that's not just a technical one, it's a relational one. It's one in which restoration and reconciliation and consilience all play a role. So I think there's enormous opportunity in this, in a formulation for us going forward, in which as we restore our lands, we restore ourselves, we bring our culture back into better relationship with the land and with each other. And I'm really excited to hear what, over the course of the day, what this group has to say about how we actually get there.
Yeah, you actually answered a lot of the first questions, so we're gonna have to go to another person. Yeah, so it's my pleasure now to introduce Forrest King Cortez. Growing up in Chicago, Forrest was an avid participant in the city's Eco Explorer Camp, which ultimately contributed to his pursuit of a Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Ecology and Management. Forrest worked with the Nature Conservancy in Illinois as a trained ecologist and as the Director of Community Engagement. There, he helped Chicago residents fall in love with and stewarded the open spaces he enjoyed as a child. And now as the Director of Community-Centered Conservation for the Land Trust Alliance, Forrest is helping Land Trust all across the country build relationships in communities where they have not historically invested. Forrest is also a champion for our movement, elevating more leaders of color, LGBTQIA+ people, and people with disabilities to make our community way more welcoming and inclusive.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be in community with all of you. It's good to see you all here. I'm really excited to meet some new folks today and see some folks that I haven't seen in a little while. As Bill mentioned, my title is Director of Community-Centered Conservation at the Land Trust Alliance. And many people know the Alliance for our work to support land conservation organizations, to support land trusts across the country. Over 900 organizations, in fact. And many people know that we're a capacity builder. We provide grant programs, trainings, convenings, peer learning, and problem-solving thought partnership to organizations across the country, including in this region. What's new for us, but is not a new commitment overall, is our Community-Centered Conservation Department. So just last November, we launched a department dedicated to turning our capacity building skills toward a different future for conservation that prioritizes people, that puts people first, and that strives to bring benefits to all communities equitably. And so, as Bill mentioned, that really means Black, Indigenous people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA people, and others who the movement hasn't fully served or possibly even engaged with over the course of its existence, which is decades. And so I really think a lot about what it means for us to work towards repairing relationships, towards building trust with communities. And we have to do that at every scale that we work at. We have to do that at the community scale when we're working in a specific neighborhood, a specific city, a specific town. We have to do that at the regional scale at which many folks in this room are working. And we have to do that at the national scale. I don't get a pass from building relationships and connecting with people just because I'm working at the national level. We have that responsibility at all levels. And so I was reflecting on one of the prompts, which was the imperative for conservation to address more. And it left me with three kind of key takeaways that I wanted to state. The first is that our communities, other sectors, Black, Indigenous people of color, LGBTQIA people, people with disabilities, are already doing more. And what I mean by this is that it is in some ways a privilege to think about our work in silos. It is a privilege to be able to prioritize certain topics and table others for later, or say this isn't in our lane, or this isn't something we need to worry about right now because we have a lot of things going on. For many communities, these issues collide in real time and they come together in real time, and communities are working actively to address these challenges, and they have the solutions in their own backyards and in their own neighborhoods and in the people around them to address many of these challenges that we've talked about: affordable housing, climate crisis, racial justice, social justice, environmental justice. And so when I think about the need to do more, I think about our need to show up as allies, active, informed, willing, flexible allies to support the work that's already happening on the ground and the expertise that already exists in many communities and in other sectors across the country. And so to some of the remarks earlier, this is good news. We're not in this alone. We're doing this together, and we have others who are leaning in to do this work and have been doing this work for the past 40 plus years as we've been doing our great conservation work. The second point that I really wanted to make was that the ability for conservation to do more is dependent on our ability to partner with communities and other sectors. And this, in turn, is dependent on our investment in, commitment to, and implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion principles in ourselves and in our organizations, especially trust and relationship building. These are the foundations upon which success rests. We can't hope to build new partnerships. We can't hope to effectively and beneficially engage communities without leaning in and doing the pre-work to get ourselves ready for that, to ask the tough questions within our organizations. It's not about bringing more diverse people to the table. It's about making that space welcoming. It's about making that space open, and it's about being ready to receive the expertise, the perspectives, and the diversity in all of its forms that's going to come when you do that. And my third point that I wanted to really make is that, okay, and I want to know who's counting how many times you're going to hear the terms pace and scale today. So this is maybe like the third already, maybe the fourth. But pace and scale do matter. But sometimes to do more, we have to go slower pace. And sometimes we have to also remember to think smaller, scale, community scale. So when we're looking at landscapes, these are not a monolith. These communities are not a monolith. Any given town or city is not a monolith. There's so much diversity, and as we seek to do this great work as quickly and as effectively as possible, we have to remember to slow down, to make time for trust and relationship building, and also to ensure that we're giving each unique community the time that they need to be in dialogue with us, to be in relationship with us, and that we're recognizing the expertise that they're bringing to the table. And so let's not forget, as we talk about pace and scale today, to think about what does that mean? It's not a consistent pace and scale. We may have to slow down. We may have to think large, think small. We've got to be nimble like that. And then lastly, I just wanted to close with saying that the folks in this room, you all are no strangers to the power of partnerships. You do it every day, whether it's an individual conservation organization, a regional conservation partnership. We have these muscles, we have these skills. When we talk about relationship building, trust building, who in here is a fundraiser or does it for part of their job? Everyone's a fundraiser, right? Well, ask your fundraising colleagues, or think about this the next time you're interacting with a foundation or an individual donor. Relationship building is key. And the trust building, the alignment finding, the time that it takes to build up to an ask, to build up to something that feels more concrete, is really the bulk of that work. And our fundraising colleagues, those of you that do it in this room, know about the value of budgeting your time for that early phase relationship building, know about the value of engaging in dialogue, of listening, of really finding alignment. And we need to take those skill sets and value community expertise and partner expertise at the same level and dedicate that time in our work plans, our budgets, and our strategic plans so that we're making the time for the relationship and trust building work ahead, because that's really the bulk of what is ahead for us. Thank you so much for being here today.
Right, so the first question is really a why question, kind of revisiting why we're here. So why are we talking about integration, coordination, and collaboration around these three issues: biodiversity conservation, land justice, and climate resilience? And it may seem like there's a simple answer. It's okay if the answer is simple, but I think we need to talk about that, because the vast majority of people here are working at the landscape scale. They're working at multi-town, multi-county. They're crossing political boundaries. We're going to also talk about what you just mentioned about hyperlocal, because that's what we learned in the 2020 gathering, was focusing on hyperlocal. But again, about the coordination, integration, because you could imagine an organization focusing on climate justice or climate resilience, and then biodiversity conservation, and then justice over here. But why are we talking about them being integrated and interconnected? I'm going to start with Onika.
Hello. Okay. Yes. I wrote down in big letters that silos are a privilege, because I think that is the realest answer to that question I've heard in a while. And literally, we are working on a series for our funders and a part of our funder forum around breaking down silos. Part of the issue, and now I'm speaking from my perspective as a funder organizer, is that funders impose, we all know this, funders impose these silos upon communities. How many, as a nonprofit director, which I was up until a couple months ago, how many times did I have to create some kind of, applying for an FSA or USDA or private foundation application, had to really try to narrow the scope of our work to fit what was asked of us. the reason why integration is important is because that is the reality on the ground, and that people actually are living lives that are intersectional and need more holistic solutions. So I think that that is the most basic answer. I think from my perspective, part of the work that I want to do is to make sure that the funding that is coming to you allows for that kind of flexibility, allows for that kind of holistic approach, and also just in terms of, basic grant-making practices that can support that around general operating support, multi-year funding, and the recognition of the allotment of time and energy that is necessary to create those relationships. I think a lot of that is imposed upon the projects that you are trying to create now, and realizing that funding is oftentimes the force that's imposing that, really wanting to work to dismantle that, and the work that I'm doing.
So I don't know if either of you have something to add, but I wanted to get a little bit down to the basics. Did one of you have
Well,
something to add?
I would just add one, I'll own the funding, the reinforcing the silo part for sure, and I think that's a reflection as much as a driver of the silos that we see. But frankly, I think we're out of time on all three of those challenges. We have no more time to not address them, and we need to work. We do need to work really quickly, but solving them relates to the same piece of ground a lot of times, and so we have to reconcile all three on the landscape, because in order to go fast, we can't not go together in solving all of them.
So that piece that you just said about, you said this before about that it's all happening on the same ground. I'd like us to actually get explicit about how they intersect on the ground. For example, climate resilience, biodiversity, conservation, and land justice. If you're to center equity in your work, how would you move forward with the biodiversity conservation activity if you're centering equity? That's what I'm interested in getting to, because I think a lot of people in the audience, my sense is, and for myself as well, is I have to get down to the nitty-gritty of, like, what are we talking about here? Because you can say they're interconnected, and these ideas are interconnected, but when you're planning a project, a lot of the people in the audience, you have to prioritize your investments, right? And so you're making decisions about where to spend money, where to put staff time. And if you want to do these things in an interconnected way, like you were saying, Forrest, about focusing on hyperlocal, that you're saying that if you're working with a community, that community is already working in multiple ways, dealing with all three of those topics. But I'm just wondering, how does an organization, a conservation organization, bring all three of those together around centering on equity, for example, just starting with that? I don't know if Sasha, you have something to offer.
Well, I tend to think of these in very spatial terms, right? Like, I think in my mind, like a GIS approach to this, but because that's one really easy way to algorithmically solve for this multi-challenge, right? But it may not. But translating that to the ground is a different sort of challenge. And so I sort of try to think of the same principles that we tend to build into landscape scale prioritizations for biodiversity. Representation of all species and habitats on the landscape. Sufficiency, enough space for each of those to be well represented. Connectivity between places, and resilience over time, so those conservation values are durable to changes. Each one of those things can be translated into the kind of equity realm. We want representation of all voices at the table. We need sufficiency, so that all those voices are getting enough out of that interaction. Connectivity across jurisdictions, across social groups, and resilience by building durable coalitions around the work. We create real resilience for this agenda. And it is not to say that the same project within a landscape scale is going to solve everything every time. But at the landscape scale, the scale that you are working at, is where in aggregate we can address all three.
So I'm going to speak to, you're a trained ecologist, for us. So I'm going to ask you a question. A recovering?
But still deeply passionate.
Yeah, I remember something that Steve Fuller, who was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, told me a number of years ago, which was, if you look at the landscape and think about from a biodiversity standpoint, especially if you're trying to have interconnectivity from, say, coast to the uplands, right? Where on the coastal area, you have more people likely, but it's the riparian buffers where there's like very rich in terms of biodiversity. So I often think about if you're investing in a sense, conserving biodiversity across the landscape, are you prioritizing areas where there are more people? Is that something you'd see that would be a choice for a conservation organization to make? So it's not just resiliency from the perspective of who's at the table and who's making decisions, but where the money is being spent. And if you can make, even if you know that in the hinterlands, large forest blocks, all very important, that's going to continue to be conserved. But what do you think about riparian buffers and stepping stones of open space across in a more built landscape? Do you see that as a way in which we can combine land justice with climate resilience and biodiversity conservation?
What do I think about riparian buffers? I love them. But to your question, I guess first as someone, I am an ecologist, but I have now worked as a community engagement professional for so long, and in many different communities, and so my mind goes there first. And the first thing I thought of was that it's not always about thinking about the landscapes that have the most people on them, but which people. And to really think about who your organizations have prioritized in the past and who has received the benefit of your work in the past and maybe even up into the present. And to really be honest with that and to have those conversations internally. Who's currently benefiting from the land conservation work we do? And the data are out there. Now we can start to transition to the hard science side of things and the ecology side of things. But there are ways to map these things, right? Like there are demographic data out there that we can use and integrate alongside our landscape data about conservation priorities. There are some really amazing examples coming out of North Carolina, coming out of Chicago and other places where these maps are visually bringing together socioeconomic variables and environmental variables and things like impacts of climate change, like urban heat, like poor air quality. And you can see in real time areas where your organization can prioritize focus, where there's a community that may have limited access to green space, but also that green space is some of the most diverse and rare habitat in the state, for example. That happens in Chicago, where I'm from. It's actually one of the biodiversity hotspots in Illinois, and at the same time you have environmental justice hotspots coming together, you have cultural diversity coming together, and people celebrating nature in different ways depending on their culture. You have health care access, you have food access coming together, and you can literally look at a map of where these vulnerabilities or where these demographic variables exist and help to prioritize your work. So it's not always about the most people, I think, but which people and who really needs to be prioritized and who haven't been prioritized before.
That's awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to jump to the next question. We kind of moved into it a little bit. It's going back to what would integrated climate resilient, biodiverse, just land use look like? Thinking about if you were successful. We're successful in doing this in a more integrated way. And we can think about what we do, how we do it, and outcomes as a way of kind of thinking about this. So if you can imagine that landscape that is more biodiverse, more resilient to climate change, and is more just, can we just talk about that? What would that look like in terms of patterns? I throw the patterns out there just because this notion of landscape ecology in the early 90s, no land trust knew what it meant. It was like a new science and the concepts of landscape ecology, but by now, you can't open a town open space and recreation plan without seeing the concepts right there. People understand connectivity and stepping stones and bigger is better and all that. But we haven't yet, I'm trying to figure out, like, what does an interconnected landscape look like? When conservation is more interconnected with land use, what does that look like? So I just wanted to open that up. And should I pick someone, or do you want to start?
I can start. Taking the question back to your original question, just about the big vision of what this could look like if it's well integrated. I think for me, I would definitely say that it would look different depending on the community that you're centering, right? Part of my background is in farming. As I mentioned, I'm the granddaughter of 2 farmers, one in Alabama and one in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I think that one of the things that is really important to me is like ownership of land. I think stopping land loss and land grabbing, both here domestically as well as internationally, would be a big part of that vision for me. I think, as recently as 2021, ProPublica did this article about land grabs and the ways that Black farmers are being dispossessed of their land for conservation use. And I know that there's been a lot of effort to cease that. And I think that is a really important part of this work. I think that there are ways that we can sit alongside of these land stewards and ask them and research and spend time with them about the ways that they're already accomplishing a lot of the goals that we want to do around biodiversity, and learn from that and support that and put our money and our efforts behind keeping them on that land and bringing them the resources they need to do that work better. So I think that that's just one example, but like, who is already on that land? How do we center and support them to do our shared vision of what protection looks like? And oftentimes it's not exactly the way it looks in conservation world language. It might not look the same way. It might not, there might not be as much power and control in the hands of the conservation movement in that way. But I think the ultimate goals of integration can be accomplished better if land stewards stay on that land and we work with them and support that vision. So Black farmers is only one example. Obviously, Indigenous communities are a huge part of this as well. And I think there's a lot of land that's still in private ownership that we have opportunity to create and repair some of those relationships with those original land stewards. And to me, that is a big part of this ultimate vision of integration. Because they're already doing all those things that we're talking about. They're already doing, a lot of work around healthcare and food sovereignty. All of that is often being done by land stewards that are on the land or already have.
I love that point. I think, and your point about the power structures that have led to the patterns of land ownership and retention over time, those are not unfamiliar to anyone in this room, right? Those are structures that now go under the name of zoning, right? And density limits and things like that, which are driving other crises here, right? The housing crisis. Our inability to encourage or enable density through zoning has led to not just housing insecurity, but also sprawling land use patterns and increased carbon emissions as a result of the transportation patterns that locks in, and all of those things. So we can attack some of these power structures at their roots that are also, they turn out to be multi-solutions. But maybe to another part of your question, Bill, is this question of how do we actually recognize it on the landscape? How do we measure it? I mean, there are the indices, right? There's the 10-minute walk index. There's a new tree equity score available that we were really proud to be an investor in. There are other ways of measuring that. The flows of conservation capital is another metric that I think we need to be looking at. You mentioned not just the amount of land, but that indigenous peoples in this country actually control. It's about 5% of our national landscape is owned or controlled by native peoples. But there's $0 of dedicated federal money for that 5% of our national landscape. And so the actual structure of funding programs and the flows of private capital toward those parts of the land is another metric that I think we need to be looking at really carefully.
And I feel like this audience knows this better than I do, but I was amazed to find out that 5% of land that's actually owned by or under stewardship by Native communities, worldwide anyway, my understanding is that the 20% of the land that is actually under stewardship by indigenous communities has over 80% of the biodiversity. So I just really realizing the incredible stewardship that's happening on those lands and then recognizing how underfunded they are, it just feels like a huge opportunity. And you talk about federal dollars, but we also know that the philanthropic community is not doing much better in this area at all. So.
I want to chime in on some thoughts that I had when you were speaking, Onika, which were like the enabling conditions for a just landscape. And the first one that pops to mind for me is trust. And I said this earlier, and we've all talked a little bit about it, but it goes both ways. There's both the need for us to earn the trust of the communities we seek to work with, and on the flip side, we need to trust that communities have expertise in stewardship, that communities have relationships to land, that communities deserve to be decision makers, deserve to be at the table helping to decide priorities. And so when I think about what a just landscape looks like, when we're embodying that trust, it's land back, it's land returned to indigenous people, trusting that they have deep expertise, that the stewardship is there across many generations. It's bringing folks access to land that we manage and trusting that they will responsibly use that land because they will, and that they have stewardship knowledge and expertise and traditions that we also need as a movement, and that their access is not limited to just coming and using the land, but access to the places where decisions are made, access to the places where priorities are set, and access to the places where strategic plans are written. And so I think a lot about trust as being an enabling condition, and that the landscape will have a lot more trust on it amongst all of us, amongst our communities, as we move into a more just and biodiverse future. I'm not going to spend too much time on the biodiversity side of things. I feel like people in this room really have that down.
Before we move off, I really want to just touch on, you mentioned zoning and land use, and we were talking about strategic plans, and access. I'm just wondering, and it could be that because I'm a planner, that I have to touch on this, but about this notion of, this having conservation be more integrated with planning. Do you see municipal planning, for example, be a way in which, if the conservation committee were to see those plans as being ideally consensus, the local consensus of what people care about. In some way, we're able to incorporate that into their thinking. Because in many cases, a municipal plan, they identify where they want renewable energy, where they want industrial development, commercial, residential, etc. Do you think that's a way in which, it's, again, like a first step towards engaging more of the community?
Yeah, I think in organizational management conversations, we talk a lot about planning fatigue, and we talk about, like some of us may be like, another strategic plan's coming down the pipe, like we just did the other one. But planning fatigue is real in communities too. If we're feeling it, the communities that we're working in are feeling it. And so when healthcare organizations, when social service organizations and conservation organizations are all coming to communities and asking for input at different times, at different periods, and it's disconnected, that's a real burden on communities, and people get tired, and people don't want to show up for meetings. And I know this from years of organizing on the ground. But also, when you come together and approach planning from a multi-sector perspective, funders really like that, I think. There's funders up here. But also, elected officials really like that. It's a good win. It's constituents coming together around issues that are sometimes separate and sometimes in competition with one another. That's certainly the case we've learned with affordable housing partnerships between land trusts and affordable housing organizations. When they can come together in front of either policymakers and legislators or governing agencies, there's a lot of power there to get people's attention. And so I think there are many reasons to bring the planning together, but to do it in a way that we're sharing the space and we're sharing the mic, and it's not the conservation show with an addendum about all these other things, but that we're really truly embracing all of the things that come together in that space.
A great segue to the next question. So You all read the story map, I'm sure, right? Your homework. So you know something about RCPs and the roles they play in landscape conservation. So if you could think about, what we've been talking about is really how to help RCPs consider and advance activities around multiple objectives. Not just RCPs, conservation organizations writ large, but so just wondering if you have some thoughts about ways in which RCPs, the potential roles of RCPs in this work versus an individual organization.
I'll give it a shot. So the scale that RCPs work at is so fundamentally important as the bridge between the kind of the broader set of outcomes in the world that we're trying to create and the work on the ground. Right? It is exceedingly hard for individual municipalities or individual town-based organizations to feel connected to or responsible for contributing to this mega set of outcomes. But RCPs are able to think a lot bigger than that and to interface between state and federal ideas and state and federal plans and the individual actors on the ground. That role is indispensable right now at a time when we're trying to figure out how do we get to some kind of master plan national approach to solving these three crises, but recognize that it's only going to happen from bottom-up activity. And it's only going to have license if it's driven in that way. So that to me is the crux of the challenge. And RCPs are essentially the brokers in that dialogue. So go Kevin.
That's an excellent point. And I just want to build on that. So Forrest, earlier you were talking about working at a local level, and Monica, you were saying too, that some communities, they're dealing with multiple issues already, right? They're dealing with affordable housing and food security. So one could say, well, if, say, members of RCPs were to build relationships with communities that are already engaging in those multiple levels of activities, that certainly would be a way to kind of build relationships and get to know about what are the issues on the ground for people, real people in their regions, right? But to your point, Sasha, what is the role, again, thinking about the unique role of an RCP in this work, I'm thinking back to the role of RCP in terms of having multiple perspectives. I don't want to give you the answer, but you already have, RCPs have something like average 14 members, organizations and agencies, right? Well, most of them are conservation related, but you can imagine, other people at the quote-unquote table, whether the table's out there in the community or it's in their meeting room. Do you see a role for RCPs to bring in others, and what other sectors might you think would be most useful, perhaps?
I have a couple thoughts on that. I think the first one is RCPs is a space for troubleshooting and also building momentum around this work, right? 14 or around that number, 5 organizations, 2 organizations even, being able to come together and trade notes on how things are going as they work to advance justice, as they work to advance equity. It's really powerful, and people are already convened. Y'all already know each other. You work together frequently. Some of the hard stuff is out of the way so you can get to the nitty-gritty and talk about what is it really going to take to move the needle. And then when there is that collective kind of sharing of information, commitment, it resonates more powerfully, right? There's that collective voice when people come together in an RCP and are jointly saying, we're committed. We're not separate organizations committing to justice, to equity, to working with people in the service of a stronger environment, in the service of healthy communities. It's all of us together saying that. So I think there's a lot there that sometimes we don't talk enough about. It's just that space to do that. The other thing I'll say is, when I was talking about partnerships at different scales, we're building partnerships at the Land Trust Alliance at the national scale with BIPOC-led organizations led by people with disabilities and more. At the RCP level, there are networks that convene non-conservation partners already out there. I don't know to what extent RCPs or any given RCP is partnering with those organizations, but they're out there. In Chicago, there was an organization called the Marshall Square Resource Network that brought together government entities, it brought together schools, residents, nonprofits, including land trusts that were based in the city. And they were advancing peace, health, education, and community response, all under one umbrella, right? That sounds familiar. And these organizations were already together and already sharing space and already talking about how environment falls into the health category, and that's how we're going to approach it because that's what's resonating with this predominantly Latino community. And so I think that making ourselves aware of these other networks that exist out there, and then thinking about not just how do we partner at the individual organizational level, but what partnership and relationship building do we need to do at this network scale is really important.
That's excellent.
I really love that, that answer and that response. It leads me to, one thing that I have been aware of is to really interrogate the meaning of partnership and what we're talking about when we say partnership and what we might not be talking about. The reason why this is important to me is that I have been, when I ran smaller nonprofits, I had been a partner in a whole lot of different networks and projects, a partner in on paper, a partner that was called in after the grant was mostly already written, and they said they wanted a small BIPOC-led organization, that did X, Y, Z in the community to be a partner, because it looked good on this particular application, and in actuality, they'd already kind of set all the objectives and it was all done already. That to me isn't a true partnership. And so I really want to interrogate that and lift up the partnerships that are much deeper than that and are more built on relationship, like what we've been saying earlier. Those that are, I think what is often exemplified by that is when the larger partners or potential partners actually go out into the community and sit alongside of networks and organizations that are already existing and find out what is bubbling up as a concern from them, and then build upon that relationship and really take into account not just these on-paper partnerships. And really, I think part of the issue is that they're already doing a lot of work already. So coming to your table is often really cumbersome and taking folks away from the work that they're already doing in their community. So how can you go to their table? How can you lift up what's being said within those communities and weave that into the work that's being done and channel money and power into those ways that they're already moving forward a lot of the agenda that you want to also pursue. So I just want to really, for all of us to be able to unpack what partnership really means and make sure that it's more deep and more sustained across the board with our projects feels important.
So just a quick follow-up question too, from a philanthropic foundation perspective, if you had an applicant saying, hey, we're going to do this reaching out to new communities, building relationships, and building these multi-sector partnerships, but we have limited capacity. From your perspective, what capacity do you think they need in order to make that be a successful endeavor?
Blue Sky Funders Network works with funders like Sasha. We do not actually give out funding. But I would hazard to say that I think one of the biggest concerns for me has to do with the ways that money is rolling out to a lot of our projects and making sure that it is sustainable, multi-year funding, that is general operating support, that does not have a lot of objectives that create pressure to achieve certain outcomes within a short amount of time, which I think is partly why we get these last minute phone calls, like, come on, let's do this project. This is a small window of opportunity, we have to do X, Y, Z. That is not helpful to creating sustainable partnerships. So I think one of those things is making sure that we are providing funds that are needed for that. Multi-year operating support funds is really important. I also really want to one of the things that I think can also be important, I don't know, when you're giving out amounts of money like Doris Duke, I think this can be hard, but it's really understanding on the ground where are those BIPOC-led organizations and how can you support their leadership in this? Oftentimes, I think finding coalitions of these organizations to fund as opposed to some of those larger organizations that are sometimes the backbone organizations can be really helpful. So, for example, we would often work with Cornell University, another land grant in New York State, around different types of applications for government funding. And it would be great in the sense that we were able to access a larger amount of money that we weren't able to get before, but we were also unable to build capacity within our own organizations to do the grant writing, to do the reporting, to do the financing, to really be able to do the work on the ground. And I think that what really changed for us is when we were able to come together as a coalition and apply for that funding, and then ask Cornell to support us with a lot of support, support us with some back-end reporting infrastructure. And that way we were able to change that power dynamic so that the communities on the ground were really holding the power, decision-making around moving that funding. And I would encourage our funders to look for ways to support coalitions of smaller groups on the ground to do this work. It's harder, but it also means that we're shifting power dynamics that change a lot of what we're experiencing on the ground.
Sasha, do you have anything to add?
Well, I mean, there's so many different capacity needs, and capacity to do what is a really key part of that. But I think in this particular moment, to your point about the resources that are available, I mean, I think it's pretty undeniable in a lot of ways that we're in a time of unprecedented plenty for conservation. LWCF has doubled. There's hundreds of millions of additional dollars in the Forest Legacy Program. There's $6 billion in the IRA for $20 billion in the IRA for USDA programs, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Getting it to the ground in the right ways is a key capacity. We've been supporting sort of these backbone organizations to provide the grant writing and the kind of administrative capacity to organizations around the country. So that's a very specific kind of capacity that's needed right now more than ever. But we also support the really hard stuff sometimes. It's not always easy, but the hard stuff to raise is the backbone coordinator role for an RCP. It's just like the person that makes sure that this partnership comes together over and over and is driving toward greater levels of coordination, partnership, strategy, all of the things that we know drive success in a partnership. We've been supporting for several years now with the Hewlett Foundation, the Landscape Conservation Catalyst Fund, which is organized and which is administered by the Network for Landscape Conservation. And that just provides relatively, quite small grants, frankly, to support those coordinators over time. And so that's not a flashy kind of grant, but it's the fundamental mechanism for sustainable partnership.
Excellent. Time to stop there. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the speakers.